Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely returning special guest, Julia Keleher. She is the CEO of Solution Partners and the former secretary of the Puerto Rico Department of Education. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back. I feel like, last time's conversation felt like half the story. And so, we had to do a part two, and I'm kind of excited to get the second half now. We had
Great.
left off last conversation. And for any of the listeners who haven't heard, I would highly recommend listening to part one before continuing this conversation. But the last conversation, we had left off talking about your experiences, growing up, how you got interested in working in Puerto Rico, the lessons that you learned working there. And we ended with you leaving after Hurricane Maria and the trial. And so we talked a little bit about the details of the trial. And just to start this conversation off, if we can just kind of get into a brief summary of the case, I think that'll be a great place to start, and then we can move from there.
Yep, sure. So I think, yeah, that's probably a great point for anyone who's joining now for the first time. I became Secretary of Education in January of 2017. And as I mentioned, we closed approximately 200 schools in May of that year, so about 5 months in. And then 4 months later, Hurricane Maria hit, which completely devastated the island, wiping out, the limited infrastructure that was there, and really taking a toll on schools and communities. And schools, I don't know if we talked about this, but they serve as the shelters in Puerto Rico. Um,
Mm.
so so schools are really central to a lot of the community, the life of the community. Anyway, by the end of that school year, we the system was up and running. I mean, we really had schools open again by October, which was kind of shocking when you look at it compared to other systems. But in May of that year, we did the second round of school closings, and it was about another 200. So all told, it was about 450 schools that closed by May of 2018. 3 months earlier, we passed an education reform bill, the first one that had been passed in about 10 years, and it was very controversial. One of the most important elements of that bill was ensuring that there was a per pupil allocation, that the money would follow the student. And then we also decentralized the school system. So instead of having a unitary system, we created 7 educational regions and sort of pushed the accountability and responsibility more closer to communities and to the parents who are served by schools. That year, the budget cycle in the summer of 18, we asked for $1.5 billion more, which caused a lot of concern, I think, because generally speaking, people were unaware how underfunded public education is in Puerto Rico. And then by January of the following year, so January of 19, I had decided that I was going to implement a few more of the reforms from the education reform bill. And then in April of 19, I resigned. So I left the island, I don't know, maybe April 15th. And by July 10th of that same year, I was indicted for the first time. I was in DC when I was indicted. Um, and then there was an arraignment in Puerto Rico. That case was the first case, and it was 1 charge of conspiracy and 8 charges of wire fraud. And then in January of 2020, there was a brand new case that was brought. That was a separate case for honest services fraud. Again, same thing, 1 count of conspiracy, or 1 count of conspiracy, and then counts of honest service fraud. All of those were related to emails, which I think we talked about, which I don't know if it's worth
We did talk
clarifying
about,
now.
yes.
When I say wire fraud, what do you think of?
Yeah, it's something that's done over it's not done through mail.
Correct. It's not done through mail. It's done through wire. So it's an email, but it is not wiring money. It's not transferring money. It's absolutely unrelated to money. It's about how the message was sent. And then in August of 2020, so 13 months after the original indictment, the federal government superseded the original indictment and changed the entire theory of the case and charged me with a brand new 24 counts, 2 of which were aggravated identity theft. So you can see this was a window of it was a little bit over a year, and there had been 3 major indictments. all with
Mm,
different theories of what the crime was. And we filed several motions that are called pretrial motions, where you ask to change venue. So we wanted to remove the case from Puerto Rico because we thought that we would get a fair trial in another jurisdiction, and that was denied. And in both cases, the judge issued a gag order preventing the defense from speaking publicly about any of the facts of the case.
mm.
So the second, at 13 months after the original indictment, and then a year and a half later is when we finally get to a place where we're deciding, are we going to go to trial or not? And the prosecution offered a plea deal, which
Mm.
eventually I took.
And that was for 6 months in a prison in Virginia, correct?
Correct. Yes. The sentence
Yeah.
was 6 months of incarceration and a year of home confinement.
Mm,
And the alternative, what's interesting about plea deals is that the defendants are incentivized to accept plea deals because it reduces the risk of going to trial, but the penalty or the exposure is much less. So the the penalty or the sentencing for a wire fraud charge is 20 years in prison. So when you look at going to trial multiple times and you're facing 20 years,
mm,
that, and then the prosecution says, we'd like to resolve the matter and the sentence will be 6 months, you can see how there's a calculus that happens there for the person
mm.
when making that choice. And that's true with all of them. And 98%, now this is a random fact, 98% of federal criminal procedures or charge cases are resolved by plea bargain. Very few
Wow.
actually ever go to court.
Mm. Because the weightage of the actual indictment is so different.
I think that the reason that um, prosecutors offer plea bargains is for expediency. So it allows
Mm,
them to process cases quicker. The reason defendants one of the many reasons defendants will entertain a plea deal is that it reduces their risk and the exposure or the possible sentence.
mm. I mean, we had briefly touched upon this earlier, but I think it's something that as I interview more people and understand more about the judicial system and what that entire process is like, is one, I think it's one of these interesting things where it's like a world separate from yours until you have to be in it.
Sure.
Right? I mean, I know nothing about that entire system until one day I will have to, and hopefully not, but it happens to many people where you have to eventually, hire a lawyer, you have to be in court, or you have to kind of familiarize yourself with what's happening. What
Mhm.
was that process like for you? I mean, just from a personal standpoint of, it must have been kind of scary in some ways.
It's completely terrifying. It is being being charged with a crime by the United States federal government is terrifying. It's a very powerful system. And one quickly realizes that most people have limited resources to be able to throw at a situation like this, unless you're a, a billionaire and you don't have to work and you have just endless resources and time. It's very hard to fight these things. Um, but it's shocking because, it's like almost a third of the US population has either been or has a family member who's been impacted by a felony offense. So the number of people that are incarcerated in the United States is astronomical. We are
Hmm.
5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population. Women are the fastest growing in the United States, the fastest growing category of individuals who are being incarcerated, and they're growing at a rate that's faster than men. And that has huge implications for society because women tend to be the caregivers and the mothers who are, especially if there's a newborn, right? And that mother gets taken out of the family or there's a young child, and it's traumatic for the child as well. It's very disruptive to the system. So those are alarming. But so yes, you don't need to know about the average American is not likely to know the intricacies of the American criminal legal system unless they've been forced to confront it, either on their own or through the experience of a family member, which again, I'm saying is 1 in 3. But it's completely disorienting because you don't know what to do. And there's a fascinating and what it led me to be much more curious about the law, and I guess that's the student in me. There's the when you file pretrial motions, you have to argue what they call the four corners of the indictment. And that means that you assume everything that's written there is true, even though it may not be. And you write a motion on the legal merits, not arguing the facts, but on the legal merits, saying why, even if this were true, it's not a crime. It's
Hmm.
an entirely different way of thinking. I mean, that legal thinking is not something that we do every day in life. So it was completely disorienting. And you lose your job, you lose your income, you lose your resources, your friends won't talk to you. You don't have a network anymore. I mean, you're isolated. There's judgment and stigma. And this, I think we talked about this too, that the presumption of this innocent until proven guilty is not really how the person who's charged experiences that.
Hmm.
It's more like she's guilty until you prove to me she was actually innocent.
Hmm. So when that the first day, I mean, I'm just so fascinated in some ways of like what that process is like. I mean, so you get indicted and then immediately are they busing you to the prison or
So you're,
convicted, I guess?
yeah, no, so at 5 o'clock in the morning, well, so you get indicted, the paper comes down, and an indictment is what's returned by a grand jury. The federal government is not allowed to bring criminal charges in most cases unless there's almost all the cases, but unless there's a grand jury that returns an indictment. The grand jury process is a one-sided. Are you familiar with this? I mean, this is also very fascinating if you
No,
ask
I'm
me.
not familiar at all with this.
So a grand jury gets impaneled. There are 24, between 16 and 24 people, and they're impaneled for a period not to exceed 18 months. Those individuals then spend time during which the prosecution makes its case. The defense is never present. Alternate explanations for the theory of the case are not presented, and the prosecution is allowed to present information and evidence to a grand jury that is not admissible in court. So the rules
Hmm.
of evidence do not apply. So you have one person who or a team of prosecutors who go in and they're able to speak to the grand jury on their own behind closed doors. It's secret. We don't know who the grand jurors are. We don't know what's said, and the rules of evidence don't apply. And then after X number of months of hearing this, the grand jury will decide to indict or not indict. When that comes back, that gives the government permission to arrest the citizen. So they knocked on my door in Washington, D.C. at 5:30 in the morning, and I quickly put my clothes
Did you
on.
know they were coming
I did
at that
not.
moment? Oh, so it was just like were you surprised?
Terror, yes. I mean, and it's a big banging on the door, right? It's like it sounded as if the door was gonna break, like be broken in. Like it's and
Hmm.
it's I mean, there's no point of reference, right? The only thing you've seen this like on TV, right? Like what is happening? So I'm in my nightgown and I've got to get dressed. They let me get dressed and then they take me to a holding facility in Southwest DC. And I'm there from 6:30 to about 9 alone in the room. And then they move me from there to Judiciary Square, where I'm then processed by Metropolitan PD. And then from there moved over to the US Marshals and with handcuffs and shackles and a chain and put in a cell to wait until the afternoon session for my initial appearance at 1:30. Only
And
woman in the facility, and there were about 20 other men who were all going to be seen by the judge that day. Five
what
minutes before the it's time to go in, the public defender comes through. She has a pile of papers in her hand, a stack about, I don't know, maybe 6 inches thick. And she's got everyone's indictment because now everyone's going to get to read what it is. Up until that point, I had no idea why I was there. It said conspiracy and wire fraud. That's it. Two words on the top. It's one sheet of paper that they serve you and they came in the door. So then I finally get to read the indictment. And then we walk into the courtroom and I have a public defender who I don't, I don't know. And then the US attorney was represented by the officials in DC. They asked for remand, which would have meant that I would have had to stay in prison until I was transported to Puerto Rico. And the public defender asked for me to be released on my own recognizance since I wasn't a flight risk and had no priors. So then I went home. But mind you, when I say I got indicted 3 times, that process, even though they didn't knock on the door, I had to go for an appearance. Something had to happen with the court every time there was a new indictment.
Hmm.
So then the judge said that I would need to report to Puerto Rico in like a week. And I went to Puerto Rico, and you can see this on there's video of it of my arrival at the federal courthouse, where there was a mob. I had private security. The security at the gate was there, and both were insufficient to control the mob and the press. I was physically attacked, verbally attacked, punched, kicked, shouted things, all while we're trying to just get through security. The mob goes through the initial gate so much, and it was so out of control that the security from inside the building had to come out to get us to walk us in the building. So it was pretty intense.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that, so how did I feel? I mean, how does one feel? Like you feel like your world is crumbling. None of this makes any sense, you know? I
Yeah.
mean, and the only people who understand it are lawyers who know how to do things that are doing things that don't seem to make any sense, because they're saying we've got to assume that everything written on this page is true. And I'm like, but it's not. And they say, but it doesn't matter because that's how you file a pretrial motion. It's
Hmm.
fascinating. But it led me to a love of that, and I subsequently got a paralegal certificate. And when I was incarcerated, I tried to help a lot of the women navigate some of the legal hurdles. I spent time volunteering in the law library and would search cases and print out documents and try to make tip sheets so that it was easier for the women to find the resources that they need. It's very disorienting.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was really excited to kind of get into that as well. I mean, so the first day in prison, well, I want to kind of step into the world of what that was like.
So I reported on February 22nd, 2022. My parents drove me to Alderson. I arrived there on the day that the unit went to commissary, which meant that I didn't get to go to commissary, which meant that I would go for the whole next week without any toiletries or food other than what was given to you. It was really rough in the beginning, but I think that going to Alderson gave me an opportunity to meet so many incredible women who have survived unimaginable traumas and series of traumas in their life, who found themselves in separated from their children and struggling to make sense of a lot of things, who didn't have all of the skills they could have had to navigate the environment they found themselves in. And a lot of that has to do with the failure of public education. The 90% of the women who were there were not white collar crime. They had come from other facilities, and they had limited education attainment. They had been failed too by the public school system. And I became very close with a group of women from Puerto Rico who um, I wound up becoming an ESL teacher there, and so we spent a lot of time learning English, but I also spent a lot of time translating and trying to, whether it was verbally or with written documents or writing something down. Because again, in Puerto Rico, the public schools didn't have a sufficient English program, so the large majority of students who graduate don't have English. So imagine how scary it is to go to prison with a new set of rules. You can get in trouble for anything. It's a different society with the different structure than the free world. And you can't understand the language that the directions are being given to you in, right? I mean,
Hmm.
that's like double punishment, right? You're now incrementally vulnerable. So so yeah, it was challenging, but a lot of I've seen I had a lot of really positive experiences with a lot of women who, in the worst of circumstances, showed up to be the best that they could be.
Hmm. I mean, I think this experience of being in an environment that's very different than what you expect yourself to be always ends up throwing, the more challenging it feels in the beginning, I feel like when you end up overcoming it, the more lessons that often come out from it. Did you feel in those 6 months you were constantly counting the date that you were going to leave, or at some point did you just say this is it's going to be for a while, and then did you settle in? What was that like?
The first to 3 days, I think your body goes in, what my body did, went into like a complete shutdown. You're just so
Mm,
overwhelmed with what you've lived through, and the stress is just so much that you're overstimulated. And so I slept. I remember, just being like knocked out, like I just didn't have the energy to do anything. And initially I did ask myself, why am I here? Well, how did I get here? Why did, how did this happen? And I realized by, the end of the first week, beginning of the second, that like there's really no good answer for that question. That's not a useful question to be knocking around my head. The situation unfolded the way that it did. This is where I find myself. And just like every person, no matter where they are at any point in life, I was faced with the question of who are you going to be when you get up today? And what are you going to do? And quickly I tried to find a way of adding value or being connected or figuring out what my purpose was while in this place. So I went about it to be as helpful as I could. And that's how the time passed. There's a law called the First Step Act, which it was passed by Trump in 18. And it says that for qualifying incarcerated individuals, which I qualified based on my risk score and my answer to the surveys, you would earn 15 days of credit, of time credit for every month you completed. So I served the first month, right? I have 15 days. I served the
mm,
second month. I have 15 days. So now I have a month off, right?
yeah.
I served the third month. I have another 15. I have 45. And the fourth month, I now have 60 days. 60 days is 2 months, right?
Mm,
According to the rules of the First Step Act, I should have earned those credits, those time credits, and I
mm-hmm.
should have been released after 4 months of incarceration. I was not released.
The reason being?
Nobody processed my paperwork. No, I filed requests to have the time credits applied. My parents called. So that's the reality of what it's like to be in prison, right? I mean,
Mm,
things are supposed to work a certain way and they don't. So I'd say, and I raised that example, and that's not just me. I mean, there are women who should have gotten a year off, right? A year off and 6 months early release to a halfway house, and they're still sitting there.
mm,
That's devastating. There are rules, right? There are rules if the citizen is being held. And what I saw and what happened to me was that those rules weren't followed. But I think that's when you stop counting the days because there's an end date to begin with, and it's just what are you going to do? There's a saying that I was taught that you have to do the time. You can't let the time do you.
mm,
So if you're productive, if you're out there, if you're engaged, right, you're reading, you're studying, you're exercising, you're doing anything that managing a day where it's not like a regular day where in free society where you can get to you're gonna get up, you're gonna eat, you're gonna choose the things you're gonna do. They tell you when you're gonna eat, they tell you when you're gonna go to sleep, they tell you when you're gonna get counted. And so in the meantime, you have to figure out how you're gonna fill that time, or else
well,
it gets harder.
in some ways it sounds, would you say it's similar in some ways to school itself or no?
Well, I guess that's an interesting question. Um, if a child is asked to show up at a school at 7:30 and isn't given any autonomy over the decisions that they make and isn't asked to isn't doesn't have the opportunity to engage in meaningful activities, it could feel a lot like a situation of deprivation. They come in, they're told to sit down, they sit, they sit, then they get up when it's time to go to eat lunch. They eat lunch, they come back, they sit back down. You know, it's an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and I think it's a question that comes up a lot of how similar are the two. And so, something I'm curious about is, so you spent 6 months,
Mhm.
and then what was the feeling like when you knew you were, going to get released and you were coming back, when you were driving home or when you were getting, dropped off, what was that feeling like?
I think I wasn't sure they were going to let me go when it was time to let me go, and I wasn't really sure until I actually got in the car and my parents picked me up. Um, but you know, it's really nice when people who have been incarcerated come home, that people say, "Welcome home." You know, it's a I've been home for a year. I've been home for 3 months. Oh, well, welcome home. It's that is an experience. I'd also like to maybe get your opinion on something. There's a phrase, I don't know if you've heard it. It's called returning citizen.
Hmm.
You've heard it? So
Mm-hmm.
it refers to a person who's been released from prison and is now back in free society, right? Maybe with conditions, maybe not. I would like to change that term to be returned citizen with the ed, not with an ing, to
Mm-hmm.
indicate that the returning has happened. You are now back, right? And you get a chance to rebuild your life. You get a second chance. You get a chance to start over. You made a mistake, or you were convicted of a crime and you served your sentence and you've paid the penalty, and you should get a chance to start again. But that's not
Mm.
really how it happens.
That's a really interesting point. How did you feel about it? Did you feel that now that you had done the time, you kind of got to start again with the fresh slate? Or I feel like it seems that doesn't, oh yeah, I'm curious. What was your experience like that with that?
I would say the large majority of people do not respond affording that grace to
Hmm.
other people. There's a stigma, there's a judgment, um, there's a there's an unwillingness to accept, there's an intentional distancing. Um, there's a constant reminder that people will say, "Oh, you're a convicted felon."
Hmm.
So that is something that our society asks people who have been convicted to live with for the rest of their life. And I think that that's an unfair burden. And not just because it's inconvenient creates barriers for me, but I think it's not, that doesn't reflect the kind of moral or social values I would like the country to be about.
Especially if you view the entire system as trying to be reformative, you would think that once someone has gone through that process, you would then give them the grace to be like,
Mhm.
you know. And I
Yeah.
mean, I'm also very conflicted about the word reform as well. I mean, I have a lot of issues with that kind of concept as well. But so one thing I want to understand is, okay, so you got home.
Mhm.
And you have worked in education in so many different aspects and in different ways, and you eventually were working with the state of Delaware. How did you find yourself back in that position after, what was your process like to get there after being released?
So I started working in criminal justice reform in 2020, when the right after I was able to get my feet back under me from the initial indictment in July of 19. And I started volunteering with multiple organizations, both in Philadelphia and in other states, and I enjoyed that work. I also taught English online for about a year and a half. Um, and so, and then I taught when I was in Alderson. When I came home, I wound up working for the first year, one of the organizations I had volunteered for. During that time, this position in Delaware, it's with a nonprofit in Delaware, came up, and I was encouraged to apply, and I did. They had a very competitive selection process, and ultimately the board, which I'm very grateful for, decided to invest in me. There was mixed reception. There were still people who said, she's a convicted felon. She has no right to work anywhere near education. Don't you know what she did in Puerto Rico? She shouldn't have that job, in a very public, um, sort of online battle of the world deciding what I'm worthy of, what opportunities I should subsequently have. Which is it's an interesting, is a really interesting experience to have a segment of the outside world decide whether or not I was going to be able to rebuild my life. Um, And so that was challenging, but the work is great. The work is around raising awareness in communities across the state of Delaware of how bad the outcomes are. Delaware ranks at the bottom. They're in the bottom five of all states in both math and reading for fourth and eighth grade on NAEP. They spend about $17,000 per child. And this is interesting. I don't think I went, we didn't go over the numbers. Did I go over the numbers to compare Puerto Rico to
You
Delaware?
did.
Yeah.
You didn't compare the two, but you went over just the Puerto Rican numbers.
Okay. So Delaware has 202 schools and the state contribution alone is 3.5 billion. And there's 141,000 students. On top of that, 3.5 billion, they receive another probably billion and a half of federal and local dollars. So the average per pupil allocation there is around 17,000. In Puerto Rico, we had a total investment of 3.5 billion and we had 365,000 kids and 1,300 buildings. So if you look at that, I
Mm.
mean, you just ask, how are you going to distribute the same amount of money? 202 schools versus 1,300 schools, 141,000 kids versus 365,000. So the math doesn't work. But even with the investment in Delaware, which is the point of what I'm trying to get to, they're in the bottom 10% of states in the nation in terms of achievement. Only 4 out of 10 students can read on average on grade level, and 3 out of 10 can read on grade level and I'm sorry, do math on grade level. And those percentages, not surprisingly, are lower for African American, low income students, English language learners, special education learners. So you have like 1 out of every 10 kids is actually getting an education. So part of the work of First Aid Educate is to raise awareness around those outcomes so that parents understand how bad this is. In a lot of cases, students are earning A's and B's on their report cards. And there's, excellent campaigns like Learning Heroes. They try to focus attention on this, is that parents think that things are okay. But when the standardized tests come back, we're not seeing results that reflect the same as the grades that are earned. And the problem is, like, to go back to the school to prison pipeline, if children aren't educated, if they don't have an opportunity to compete, they're not going to be able to be socioeconomically mobile. They're not going to get good jobs. They're not going to be able to compete with their peers. And disproportionately, that situation affects poor and minority students to a greater degree than their white affluent counterparts. And so that's a social injustice. I think the point of me taking up that work again speaks to the commitment that I had when I started in 1996, what I tried to do in improving the conditions in Puerto Rico so that children in Puerto Rico had access to a true opportunity to learn. And then going through losing everything that I lost and suffering the traumas that I've suffered and still seeing that kind of situation and not being afraid to say, this is wrong. This is wrong, and I'm
Mm.
not going to be silent about it just because I now know what the system can do when you challenge the status quo.
Mm. And so in your time there, did you notice any changes in the education for Delawareans? Is that the word for people who
So
live
it's
there?
it's only been a year. Yes, it is Delawareans, and it's only been a year. We'll see when the scores come out. We have done a lot of work around school boards and trying to improve the quality and the diversity and the preparedness of school board members so that
Oh,
those
interesting.
sitting on because education is a local issue, right? So it's who's making those decisions at the local level. What are those policies? And making sure that, governance structures and fiscal management and the evaluation of the superintendent and the ability to understand student achievement data and to allocate resources based on those needs. That's really a capacity that we have to, I think all communities should pour into their school board leaders, because it's just the average citizen who raises their hand and says, I will serve. It doesn't mean that they had the preparation to do that. So it's a lot of professional development that they're signing up for. And we try to make sure that they have access to that so that they're prepared to
Oh,
make the tough decisions that they need to.
that's some pretty cool work actually. And so the organization built the entire kind of preparation module, or what was that
So
process
most
like?
of it we try to outsource with their experts across the country who do this work. So we wanted to bring them in, and we want to engage the school board members to participate in the training. And then you eventually make kind of like a scorecard to say which board members made which decisions, and then how did that correspond to outcomes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so your work at First State eventually led you to found Solution Partners. So,
So I founded Solution Partners actually in 2014.
oh.
I had along with Keleher and Associates, the business wasn't operational until 2019, really. But it was an idea of doing kind of a parallel structure that was not the consulting that Kelleher and Associates was doing. And I mean, it didn't have any clients until 2019. But that work has been really rewarding because I focus there more on the criminal justice space. I focus on doing strategy and execution, project management, planning, um, in with organizations, universities, anyone who's interested in implementing programs that would help justice impacted individuals.
Hmm. And so now you do both? You kind of balance half and half, or?
So, I mean, one is the I wouldn't say it's half and half. I think that there's just we talked about this earlier, I'm a person uh who really enjoys working, and so
Yeah.
I try to do as much of it as I can all the time. So I think in any time that I have my free time is where I'm looking to lend help. Most of the projects are small. Um, it's a lot of research and planning. So these are things you can do kind of in the off hours, but it keeps me busy.
Hmm. To kind of, piece together this beautiful 2 hours of total, just our journey that we've started 2 hours ago, with our first episode into where we are now. I think sometimes it's like really helpful to have kind of it's hard to remember every detail in a conversation, but to have like a nugget that you can like carry forward.
Mhm.
And so in your experiences, because I think people who have worked in education in many different aspects and have seen it through different lenses, I think have a different perspective on it than many others would just from their experiences. And so what would you say if you had to kind of package it all and bow it up would be some of the biggest lessons you've learned about education reform, and what is actually needed to make changes?
My personal experience teaches me that reform cannot be successful unless it has both grassroots and grass top support. So it's very important that the people who are leading those reform efforts are able to make meaningful connections with the communities that they're trying to serve. I think leaders who are driving for reform and change and want to disrupt the status quo need to balance their speed with the rate at which others are able to um, adopt the change or embrace the change and the requisite work that accompanies that. So I think those two things are really important. The work has to be connected to the community has to feel heard, and that the leaders reflecting their, what they want. And I don't think that when I was in Puerto Rico, people saw the change I was trying to do as reflective of what they wanted. And similarly, I think I moved very, very quickly and at a rate that was unequal of the rate at which people could assimilate the change. So those two things are important. But I think the larger question in both education and in criminal justice is that we all have, I believe, every person has a responsibility to speak up when something's wrong. And there are great quotes that I won't cite verbatim, but an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and an injustice to one person, the violation of one person's rights. So one person in the United States who's living in inhumane conditions or being treated with anything that's less than dignity um, is a is a threat to the dignity of every American, right? It's not okay. It's not okay to treat people um, as anything less than the human beings that they are, who are deserving of dignity and respect and a second chance, because we could all need that at some point. So I think that's true in criminal justice. I mean, every kid deserves a shot, and every returned citizen deserves a shot. And if you make a mistake, it's okay to pick up and start again and learn from the things you've lived through. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think those are the things that I'm taking with me.
No, very. I feel like what I'm hearing is Many philosophers have talked about this, like not treating people as means to an end, but an end in themselves. Like,
Mhm.
I think sometimes where policymakers can lose themselves is like, thinking about everything as a data point. And we talked about this kind of in that first conversation, where it's like you can sometimes have such a high level viewpoint that you forget that the changes that you're making are actually impacting real people.
Right.
And so it's important to kind of, yeah, I think the statement we used last time is to be in the party and also, view the party both. Like be able to kind of understand the lived experiences of real people while at the same time also understanding that sometimes we have to generalize to actually run a country of
Mhm.
350 million people. You can't,
Right.
you can't be at the ground level all the time. And so that balance I think is really complex. And one of the things that you mentioned, which I thought was really beautiful, is this idea that when we're impacting or enacting change, you have to be very aware of the feelings of the people who are going to be processing that change. They talk a lot about this with AI, for example. From a futurist perspective of like this is what's going to be for like students, and children in the future, that's fine. But when a thing like ChatGPT or when automated driving for truck drivers, something comes out, you have to also be aware of what are the people who are going to perhaps lose their jobs or
Mhm.
people whose education may be taken away from them because of these. What will their experience be like rather than just thinking about the people who may be benefited 30, 40 years down the line.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
think like that's where you say sometimes rapid change at the kind of cost of the people who have to experience the change sometimes misses out that complexity and the nuance of that. And I think that as well is a phenomenal point. And yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that was well said.
and I think, there were some other points you had mentioned in there, which I just wanted to highlight again, which is, this concept of reformed, like or like a returned rather
Mhm.
than a returning, to afford people the benefit of the doubt after they have, served their time or done what it is that they needed to do. I think there's I mean, I've never been to prison myself, but I've spent a lot of time in detention and just a lot, like an ungodly amount of time being punished when I was younger. And I feel that that has given me some level of empathy of just understanding how sometimes it can just feel so wrong, where you're like, I honestly don't agree with this experience. And I think like that feeling of kind of never losing that label is just unfortunate. It's just, I mean, I think it's unhelpful for everyone, for the people who go through it, for everyone else in the society, because you want people to feel good about themselves. I feel like that's the way you can have a thriving society. And so to help people get to that point, I think is really essential. And so, but I think there's so much that you said these last two episodes, and I want to thank you so much for your time and
My
your
pleasure.
insight.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure to be with you.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.